For most people, getting lost in the Appalachian Mountains sounds like a nightmare. Thousands of miles of forests, endless trails, old roads that disappear into the wilderness. Places where you can walk for hours without seeing another person. But for Mark, the mountains were supposed to be a place of peace. He had been hiking for years. He wasn't an inexperienced traveler. He knew how to read maps. He carried emergency supplies. He always told people where he was going, and he never went into the wilderness without preparation. That was why what happened to him made no sense. Because Mark didn't get lost because he was careless. He got lost while doing everything right. The trip started in late October. The weather was cold but clear. Mark decided to spend a few days hiking through a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains. The area wasn't one of the most popular tourist locations. There were no crowded trails, no large campsites, just miles of forest and old mountain paths. Before leaving, Mark downloaded offline maps on his phone and marked his route. His plan was simple: hike for 2 days, camp overnight, return before the weather changed. The first day went perfectly. He followed the trail, took pictures, stopped at several viewpoints. Everything felt normal. Around late afternoon, he decided to continue farther than planned. He wanted to reach a higher area before setting up camp. That was the first mistake. Not because the area was dangerous, but because the trail he followed wasn't on his map. At first, he assumed it was an old service path. The Appalachian Mountains are full of abandoned roads and forgotten trails. Many were created decades ago and later disappeared. Mark continued walking. The path became narrower. The trees became thicker. The sunlight started disappearing. Then his phone showed something strange. The GPS location stopped moving. The map froze. He restarted the phone. Nothing changed. The signal was gone. Mark wasn't immediately worried. He still had his compass. He still had supplies. He decided to turn around and return the way he came. But after walking for almost an hour, he realized something. He didn't recognize anything. The trees looked different. The path looked different, and the direction he believed he was walking didn't match his compass. For the first time, Mark felt genuinely uncomfortable. He decided not to keep moving in the dark. The safest option was to stay where he was. He prepared a temporary camp, started a small fire, and waited until morning. That was when he noticed something: a light, deep in the forest. At first, he thought it was another hiker, maybe someone camping nearby. He grabbed his flashlight and looked toward the trees. The light disappeared, then appeared again, a warm orange glow, like a lantern. It was coming from somewhere ahead. Mark hesitated. Normally, approaching a stranger in the middle of the wilderness at night wasn't a good idea. But the temperature was dropping, and finding another person could mean finding help. So he carefully walked toward the light. After several minutes, he saw something he didn't expect. A cabin. An old wooden cabin standing alone between the trees. The strange thing was, he had never seen it on the map. There were no signs, no trail leading to it, no indication that anyone lived there. But smoke was coming from the chimney. Someone was inside. Mark knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. The door slowly opened. Not because someone opened it, because it wasn't fully closed. Inside was a small room, a fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and a lantern burning in the corner. The cabin looked old, very old, but someone had clearly been there recently. There was fresh wood beside the fireplace, a cup on the table, and food sitting in a small container. Mark called out, Hello? No response. He waited. Nothing. The logical explanation was that the owner had stepped outside. Maybe they were nearby. Maybe they would return. Because the weather was getting worse, Mark decided to stay near the cabin for the night. He didn't want to sleep outside in freezing temperatures. He left a note on the table explaining who he was and why he entered. Then he went to sleep. Around 2 a.m., Mark woke up. At first, he didn't know why. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Outside the cabin. Slow footsteps. Walking around the building. Mark stayed completely still. The footsteps continued. One circle around the cabin. Then another. Then another. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to enter. They were just walking around. Watching. Mark reached for his flashlight. The footsteps stopped. Silence. After several seconds, a knock came from the door. 3 slow knocks. Mark didn't answer. Another 3 knocks. Then a voice. A man's voice. Quiet. Almost a whisper. You shouldn't be here. Mark froze. He wanted to respond, but something felt wrong. The voice didn't sound angry. It sounded afraid. Like whoever was outside was warning him. After a few seconds, the person spoke again. Leave before morning. Then the footsteps disappeared. Mark didn't sleep again. When the sun came up, he packed his things immediately. Before leaving, he noticed something strange on the cabin wall. Carved into the wood were names. Dozens of names. Some were old. Some looked recent. Under each name was a date. At first, Mark thought they were the names of people who had visited the cabin. Then he noticed something. Several names had years next to them. Years from decades ago. And one thing connected them. Many of the names belonged to people who had disappeared in the Appalachian Mountains. Mark took pictures of the wall. Then he left. Finding his way back was easier than expected. After walking for a few hours, he reached a marked trail, then eventually found other hikers. When he returned home, he reported the cabin. Authorities searched the area, but they couldn't find it. They searched the coordinates from Mark's photos. Nothing. No cabin, no fireplace, no abandoned structure. Just trees. At first, investigators believed Mark had simply become disoriented. Maybe he saw an old hunting shelter. Maybe his memory was affected by exhaustion. But then they looked at the photographs. The images were real. The cabin was there. The carvings on the wall were visible. But nobody could explain where it went. Years later, Mark returned to the area with a group of experienced hikers. They searched for 2 days. They found nothing. No cabin, no trail, no evidence anyone had ever lived there. But before leaving, one member of the group noticed something carved into a tree near their campsite. A name and a date. The date was the same day Mark disappeared. To this day, nobody knows who built that cabin. Nobody knows who was inside. And nobody knows why the names on the wall belonged to people who vanished in those mountains. But Mark still believes one thing. The cabin wasn't there to help lost hikers find their way. It was there because lost hikers were meant to find it. Story 2. The Voices Deep in the Woods. For many people, camping is about escaping the noise of everyday life. No phones, no traffic, no crowded streets. Just nature, silence, and a few days away from everything familiar. That was exactly what Daniel and Rachel wanted. They weren't professional hikers. They weren't experienced survival experts. They were just a couple looking for a quiet weekend in the Appalachian Mountains. They chose a remote camping area known for its beautiful views and peaceful trails. The location was popular enough to be safe, but far enough away from crowded tourist areas. They checked the weather, packed their supplies, and planned a simple 3-night camping trip. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual. At least, that's what they believed. When they arrived, everything seemed perfect. The forest was calm. The air was cold and clean. The trees stretched for miles in every direction. They found a campsite near a small stream and set up their tent before sunset. During the first day, nothing strange happened. They explored nearby trails, cooked dinner over the fire, and enjoyed the silence. But that silence was exactly what made the first strange event so disturbing. That night, around midnight, Daniel woke up. At first, he wasn't sure what had disturbed him. Then he heard it. A voice. Someone talking somewhere outside the tent. He immediately thought another camper was nearby. He sat up and listened. The voice was quiet, too quiet to understand. Daniel opened the tent slightly and looked outside. The campsite was empty. The fire had almost gone out. The forest was completely dark. He called out, "Hello?" The voice stopped. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then, a reply. Someone said his name. Daniel. He froze. The voice had come from the trees, deep inside the forest. Daniel woke Rachel. They both listened. Nothing. No footsteps?
No movement. Just silence. They convinced themselves it was probably another camper joking around, or maybe they had heard something incorrectly. They went back to sleep. The next morning, they searched around the campsite. They expected to find signs of another person. Footprints. Another tent. Anything. But they found nothing. The strange thing was that the area around their tent was covered in soft dirt. If someone had walked close enough to call Daniel's name, there should have been footprints. There were none. They decided not to think about it.
They spent the day hiking, but during the afternoon, they noticed something unusual. The trail markers looked different. A path they thought they recognized seemed to lead somewhere else. They checked their map. According to the map, there shouldn't have been another trail there. But there was. An old, narrow path disappearing between the trees. They decided not to follow it. Instead, they returned to their campsite. That night, they experienced something they couldn't explain. Around 1 a.m., they heard voices again. This time, there were multiple voices. Not one person. Several. They sounded like people having a conversation. Daniel and Rachel sat completely still inside the tent. They couldn't understand the words, but the voices sounded close. Very close. Almost directly outside. Daniel grabbed his flashlight. He slowly opened the tent. The light moved across the campsite. Nobody was there. But then Rachel whispered, "Daniel." She pointed toward the trees. Something was moving, a shadow between the branches. Daniel shined the flashlight. Nothing. The movement stopped. Then one of the voices spoke clearly. It wasn't a random sound. It was a sentence. "Are you still there?" The voice sounded like it was asking them a question, not trying to scare them, trying to communicate. Daniel and Rachel didn't answer. They stayed inside until morning. When the sun came up,
They packed everything immediately. They decided to leave one day earlier than planned. But before leaving, Daniel noticed something near the edge of the campsite. Footprints. A lot of them. They circled the tent. The strange part? They weren't leading toward the campsite. They weren't leading away either. They were just circles.
As if someone had been walking around their tent all night, watching. They followed the footprints into the trees. After about 50 meters, they stopped. There was nothing there. No person, no campsite, no abandoned equipment. Nothing. Just trees. When Daniel and Rachel returned home, they reported the incident to a local ranger. The ranger listened quietly. Then he asked a strange question. Did the voices ever call you by your name? Daniel was surprised. He asked why. The ranger explained that other campers had reported similar experiences in that area. People hearing voices in the woods. Voices calling their names. Voices asking questions. At first, everyone assumed it was other hikers. But several reports had something in common. Nobody ever found the source. The ranger told them about an old story from that part of the mountains. Years earlier, several hikers disappeared in the area. Some were found, some were never located. Search teams often reported hearing voices during the searches, but whenever they followed the sounds, they found nothing. Daniel asked the ranger if he believed the stories. The ranger didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "The mountains are old, older than the trails, older than the roads. Sometimes people think they know every place out there, but they don't." Months later, Daniel returned to the area with experienced hikers. They wanted to prove there was a logical explanation. Maybe another group was nearby. Maybe sound traveled strangely through the mountains. Maybe animals created the noises. They searched the area around the campsite. They found something unexpected. An old foundation, almost completely hidden by vegetation. The remains of a small building. Nearby was a rusted metal sign. Most of the words were unreadable, but one line was clear. "Do not enter after dark." Nobody knew who placed the sign there. Nobody knew what building once stood in that location. And nobody knew why the voices seemed to come from that exact area. Daniel never went camping there again. He still believes there was someone in those woods. Someone who was close enough to speak to him, close enough to know his name. But the question he still can't answer is, if those voices belonged to people, where did they disappear to every time someone searched for them? Story 3. The Man on the Old Mountain Road. There are thousands of roads across the Appalachian Mountains that most people will never see. Some are abandoned. Some were built decades ago and forgotten. And some seem to exist only for the people who accidentally find them. For Ethan, it was supposed to be just a shortcut home. A decision that would turn a normal night drive into something he would never forget. Ethan wasn't someone who believed in ghost stories. He enjoyed hearing strange stories from other people, but he always searched for logical explanations. There was always a reason behind something. A strange noise was usually an animal. A shadow was usually just bad lighting. A mysterious event usually had an explanation that people hadn't discovered yet. That was how he saw the world. Until one night in the Appalachian Mountains. Ethan had been visiting a friend who lived in a small mountain town. The visit lasted longer than expected. By the time he left, it was already late. The weather had changed. Clouds covered the sky. The roads were almost completely empty. His GPS showed 2 possible routes. The main highway would take longer. The second route was an old mountain road that would save him almost 30 minutes. Ethan chose the shorter route. At first, Everything was normal. The road was narrow but easy to follow. Tall trees surrounded both sides. There were no houses, no streetlights, no other cars, just darkness and the sound of his engine. After about 20 minutes, Ethan noticed something strange. The GPS signal disappeared. The screen froze. Then the map showed something impossible.
The road he was driving on wasn't there. He assumed it was just an outdated map. It happens sometimes in remote areas. So he continued. A few minutes later, he saw something ahead. A person standing on the side of the road. A man. He was holding something in his hand. At first, Ethan thought it was someone who needed help. Maybe a broken-down vehicle was nearby. As Ethan got closer, the man stepped toward the road. Ethan slowed down. The man raised his hand, asking him to stop. Ethan hesitated. Everything inside him told him not to. But leaving someone alone on a dark mountain road didn't feel right. He lowered the window slightly. The man looked older. His clothes were dirty, almost like they were from another time. The man looked directly at him and said, "Don't take this road after midnight." Ethan was confused. He asked, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked behind Ethan's car. His expression changed, like he had seen something frightening. Then he said, "You need to leave." Before Ethan could ask another question, the man stepped back and disappeared into the darkness. Ethan looked around. There was nowhere he could have gone. On one side was a steep mountain slope. On the other side was thick forest. He got out of the car, turned on his flashlight, called out. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. The man was gone. Ethan returned to the car and continued driving. But after a few minutes, something happened that made him panic. The same man appeared again, standing farther ahead on the road. Same clothes, same position, same raised hand. Ethan immediately stopped. This time, he didn't open the window. The man walked closer. Slowly. Then he pointed behind Ethan. Not toward the road, toward his car. Ethan looked in the rearview mirror. At first, he saw nothing. Then the headlights caught something. Another figure standing behind his vehicle. Someone else. Watching. Ethan immediately drove away. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. He just kept driving until he reached a gas station near the main road. The entire time he tried to convince himself there was a normal explanation. Maybe two people were trying to scare him. Maybe it was some strange situation. Maybe he misunderstood everything. But when he told the gas station worker what happened, the worker's reaction was unexpected. The man asked, "Where exactly did you see him?" Ethan described the road. The worker became quiet. Then he said, "That road has been closed for years." Ethan thought he misunderstood. He explained that he had just driven through it. The worker shook his head. He told Ethan that a section of that mountain road collapsed years earlier. The route was removed from official maps. Nobody was supposed to use it. Ethan checked his phone. The road was no longer visible. The GPS history showed something strange. The route existed while he was driving. But after leaving the area, it disappeared. The next morning, Ethan returned with authorities. He wanted to show them where it happened. But they couldn't find the road. They searched the area. They found old remains of a mountain path, but nothing that matched Ethan's description. Then one officer found something. A rusted road sign hidden behind trees. Most of the words were gone, but the warning was still readable. Road closed after midnight.
Investigators later discovered an old newspaper article about the area. Decades earlier, a man had disappeared on that same mountain road. According to the report, he had stopped to help someone after seeing a person standing beside the road. He was never found. The article included a photograph of the missing man. When Ethan saw it, he immediately recognized him. It was the same person who warned him that night. The same face, the same clothes, the same expression. Years passed, but Ethan never forgot that encounter. Some people believe he saw a ghost. Others believe there is a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a trick. Maybe the stories became mixed together over time. But Ethan still remembers one detail. The man wasn't trying to hurt him. He was trying to warn him. And the question that still remains is, who was the man on the old mountain road? And what was he trying to protect Ethan from? If you made it this far, you already know the darkest stories are the ones that feel impossible. Subscribe to Lost Broadcast for more true horror stories every day.